This is the continuation of Autoline This Week, talking about the year 2017 and the biggest news stories that were going on. Joe, one of the things that we got to talk about is General Motors dumping Opel and pulling out of Europe. What a change.
Yeah, it's a big change, and that was the battle they fought coming out of their bankruptcy, and whether or not to do that at that time, and they chose not to do it. Look, I think this what they did, it goes hand in hand with what you see General Motors doing on other fronts. I mean, they're putting a lot of money into electrification, a whole new architecture, a whole new family of electric vehicles, putting a lot of money into China. They're putting a lot of money into self-driving cars and all of the technology that goes into that. And you know, they've said, and I believe them, that spending management time, not to mention capital, propping up a business that seemed to have absolutely no chance of making a decent return, and if anything, made more complex the challenges of meeting the regulatory requirements of the United States and China, because you know they really weren't doing all that well, and the European fuel economy and emissions rules were just going to get ever tougher. I got to say, looking back so far, and have to see what happens in the next couple of years, it looks like a really good decision on their part to just pull the plug on a perennial loser and put the money and the management time and attention into these more promising fields.
But a massive market. What do you guys think? How can you pull out of such a massive market?
It's such a huge pivot from their traditional strategy of volume. Bigger is better. They've owned Opel since, what, 1931, somewhere in there?
I think before that.
They bought 80% of it in 29, I think, and then bought the rest in 30.
Okay.
So a really, really long time.
Long legacy.
And it's just
and Vauxhall before that. Yeah.
And Vauxhall, yeah. And it's like, they've always prided themselves on being, the world's largest automaker. And I think post-bankruptcy, you saw them begin to really move away from that strategy and just move into these markets where they could win. They sort of previewed this when they pulled out of Russia. They were just like, this isn't working, we're done. And then, to me, I still thought for a while they would look at that engineering sort of capability that they were getting from Opel. Most of the good Buicks are Opels right now. And, to me, this is just like they took a stand. They were like, this is a really hard decision. And they decided to go and concentrate on where they can win versus just pure market share and pure volume.
They are maintaining an engineering facility in Europe.
They're keeping their diesel engine engineering facility in Italy. But who knows where diesel engines are going?
I'm kind of surprised the way they've
I wonder how many more generations.
Diesel engines. But here's the thing. Europe is no fun for anyone, even though it's a big market, even though the EU combined is roughly the size of the U.S. market. Mm-hmm. It is no fun for anyone for the reasons Joe mentioned, the regulations, the changing market among the different companies. So I think, you have the new owners of Opel, Vauxhall, Peugeot, Citroën looking to come back to the U.S. Why? Because Europe is no fun, and they've also got a step in China, but they're not doing that well there so far. So automakers are having a tough time there. So this is a good time for GM to leave. Secondly, the other big piece I think is Brexit, because while it's small in terms of volume, Vauxhall I think is the second biggest brand in the UK. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it does pretty well there compared with Opel and the rest of Europe especially. And once Brexit happened, I think that was just pushing them over the edge and saying, okay, we're out.
Yeah, absolutely. No, Brexit was a big part. I think that was the nail in the coffin. That was just that created zero hope of getting any kind of respectable profitability there.
Yeah, they even showed a negative on their books from the quarter before they sold it, due to something like $500 million or $1 billion just due to Brexit alone.
One of the important thing too, I mean, the United States market in a very painful way, in which that I'm sure no one listening to this wants to ever repeat, shook itself out in terms of capacity, both in the automaker level, the OEM level, but also the supplier level, right, during the crisis. So painful but good, because now the overcapacity that used to plague this market isn't there. In Europe, that really hasn't happened. One or two plants have been closed, assembly plants, but still there's a lot of overcapacity in that market, which holds down the margins and really
exactly. IG Metall in Germany would make you wish for a UAW plant instead of IG Metall, and you look at something like Sergio Marchionne at Fiat Chrysler, promising to build all future Alfa Romeos in Italy. Well, that's part of Alfa Romeo is not Fiats, which have a lower profit margin. You want to build the Alfas there, and the Fiats in the old Eastern Bloc.
Okay, another story we got to get to. GM dumps Opel, Ford dumps Mark Fields as CEO. Greg, what did you read into that?
I think it was all about the stock price. Ford's, their stock was just kind of languishing. It wasn't, doing some of the things that Tesla and General Motors and, other rivals were doing. And I think it was sort of like, you can't fire all the players, but you can fire the coach. And I really think that was it. Because Fields, by all accounts, was a pretty capable executive. He seemed to make most of the smart moves and then just boom, off with his head. So I think it was almost a symbolic move.
Yeah, it was symbolic in terms of the tech business too. I mean, just as GM did very well with its stock after it announced those 22 new electric vehicles a couple of months ago, Ford switched to Jim Hackett, who has a techie background, and of course they're kind of looking back to Alan Mulally and what he did for the company, or what he is perceived to have done for the company during that period. I don't think Mark Fields was that much different than Mulally, and in fact, I think Hackett recently announced cutting. Did I get the number right? $18 billion out of manufacturing costs.
So, well, the number I remember is $14 billion out of product development costs over a period of I think of 5 years. And I was going to raise that. I mean, that was a red flag. It's like, well, wait a minute. If you've got that much to cut out of your product development system against, presumably benchmarks, GM and others, that's a big problem. And somebody let that happen.
I read something else into that, though. I think the fastest way that Ford can cut product development costs is get rid of passenger car models. It has way too many passenger cars for what's happening in the marketplace now.
Well, and they're lingering on the vine. I mean, to your point about that's development costs. I mean, before Mulally, you had Ford for many years would introduce a new model and let it just kind of linger and not update it often enough, and then it would get really old really quickly. Mulally supposedly turned that around, but only for a few years, and now you're seeing the same thing especially with the Ford passenger cars, but also with the SUVs. So yeah, if you get rid of Fusion and Fiesta will be out of the U.S. market soon, then you put those into SUVs, but you still have to do a new Fusion Mondeo for Europe anyway, so how much are you really going to save?
Good question. That's a really good question. But I know for a fact the fastest way to cut product development costs is just get rid of models.
Yeah, stop doing products.
For sure.
Stop doing products.
Well, they've gotten rid of them by letting them linger too long, I think.
Okay, another topic we should touch on here, the UAW. We saw earlier in the year that the feds went after both one of the vice president, well, I shouldn't say go after one of the vice presidents at the UAW. He's passed away, but they showed that it looks like the guy sure was corrupt, and so was the vice president of labor relations at Fiat Chrysler. Now several others are being investigated. What the heck is going to happen with the union here?
I would say, look, I mean, this has been a tough stretch for the United Auto Workers Union, and it would have been tough even if none of these federal investigations had occurred or come to light. The UAW lost a big election at Nissan in Mississippi. They lost an election or an effort to organize a large Chinese supplier, Fuyao Glass, in Ohio. They have not really made any significant clawback of their loss of market share in the North American or the U.S. production world. They produce less than half the vehicles that are sold in the United States. And at some point, if your strategy for however many years, several decades, has been to go, many decades, to go to the Detroit 3 automakers every 3 or now 4 years and say, well, we need a pattern of these economic gains, and this will be our pattern settlement. I mean, the obvious response is, what pattern? You're less than half the market. You represent less than half the market. You're not the pattern. You're the outlier. And so, that's a bad place for the union to be. And then if you overlay questions of whether or not the integrity of the union's finances has been compromised, and that's to be proven. But if you overlay that and have those things being used against the union, which they were in some of these recent elections, that's a very bad place to be. So they've got work to do as an institution to get back on track.
I think they need to find a way to grow. They need to find a way to put some, wins in the win column. Whether that's, organizing more plants, whether that's, making inroads, perhaps, maybe in other industries, which is a strategy I think they tried back in the 90s. They need to find a way to grow and perhaps change the conversation, because all the things we've talked about right now, I mean, those are not generally good things. So, they've sort of got to just totally change the conversation.
Well, this kind of scandal really pushes back on that. They can find a way to grow it, to your point about the Nissan election happening at the same time. And I also think about how they've been, in the last round of negotiations, they've been trying to push back against the two-tiered wage structure that came about as a result of the 08-09, the bankruptcies in 09.
Yeah, I'd agree the union's in trouble. And speaking of scandals, now we've got these accusations of a collusion within the German auto industry. And with the potential of the German automakers facing, on top of all the diesel stuff, tens of billions of euros in fines. Any ideas as to what might shake out there?
I don't know what's going to shake out, but you're right. I mean, it's a tough situation. I mean, really, Europe really has this sort of weird cognitive dissonance about its auto sector, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's the auto sector in Europe supports tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's central to the economy of Germany, obviously, pretty central to the economy of France and to a lesser extent Italy. And yet it seems like the German automakers, even they're celebrated as these pinnacles of German industrial achievement, are getting whacked over the head with baseball bats because of their misdeeds or alleged misdeeds. So it's going to be interesting to see how all that shakes out. And you do see, or at least I've seen, the German automakers starting to kind of find a voice and say, well, look, isn't this really all about jobs? Or shouldn't we be talking about that? So I think that's one way in which they'll try to push back, is to say, well, okay, fine, you got a problem with our supplier relationships, but isn't this all about jobs? So we'll see if that works for them.
I think they need to also be especially on guard, like in the European markets of these potential punishments and fines and things they could face. I did an interview with a Volkswagen executive a couple of years ago, and he said, well, you Americans, you guys are willing to forgive. And he was kind of alluding to that, like, sort of in his home market, sometimes they get hit harder than, even like, they do here. So that could, I think they have to be really on guard for that.
Well, they do, but we also hear about how the CO2 standards, how loose some of those are compared with the kind of regulation we've had here. We were talking earlier in the show about how that may change under the Trump administration. But meanwhile, you have it kind of going the other way in Germany, where Angela Merkel is kind of caught in the middle as a center-right politician who has had too much of a serious challenge from the far right as well as from the left, and that all gets back to this thing: the far right wanting to protect jobs, and the center left, being more in favor of these regulations and cleaning up the industry.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension there, and it's going to. I mean, and I think I think it's kind of back to the question we were discussing with General Motors. I mean, can you blame General Motors for wanting to get out of that situation? Really no. Because but Daimler and BMW and Volkswagen really don't have a choice. They've got to try to figure out how to make it work, and some of these workarounds to try to cut the costs of compliance, they don't look like they're going to be allowed.
They don't have a choice, except they do to a certain extent on the employment, and that's of course where a lot of the problems are coming in. You maintain whatever numbers you have in Germany for Mercedes or BMW or Volkswagen Group, but meanwhile, what are they doing with the most popular segment, not only here but there? SUVs are being built in the United States, right? Yeah. For both our market, and some of those are going back to Europe.
Okay.
I would say that just seems like a really smart move to diversify, like sort of add this manufacturing element in the United States and China and other growing markets, and then just kind of hope your home market shakes out.
You say at B-School, optionality.
Optionality. Okay, one last topic that I think we got to touch on, and that is the performance segment of the market. We are seeing unbelievable cars coming out. The Dodge Demon, which is a drag car that you can buy off the showroom floor. Corvette ZR1, Camaro ZR1, Camaro ZL1. Ford's putting more power into the Mustang GT with a 5-liter V8. Greg, you gotta love it, don't you?
Well, it's a great time to be an enthusiast, that's for sure. And what you're seeing right now is sort of like marketing through horsepower. Like you could put the Hellcat up there with 707 horsepower, the Demon with 800 plus, and people are excited about your brand. And if that's what you want to stand for, you get people in the showrooms, and maybe you don't buy the Demon, but the V6 Challenger, you sell enough of those and you're in a pretty good place.
See, I'd be worried that the biggest dinosaurs roamed the Earth just before the asteroid hit, and the asteroid in this case is the fuel economy rules, and cars like this, I just don't know how long they survive in the product plan as fuel economy rules get more and more rigorous.
But Joe, the volume is so small, and so if you have a ZR1 Corvette, first of all, it's for the outgoing model. We'll soon have a mid-engine Corvette that will probably spawn an electric Corvette. So, again, we're talking very small volumes compared with the mass market cars. You can sell a couple Demons per month and maybe get people in showrooms to buy Dodge Challengers, but what they're really going to end up buying is a Jeep Grand Cherokee or a Dodge Journey or something like that. I mean, they're just going to say it's got the same badge, not the same car necessarily.
Well, you make a good point too, that just because it's electric doesn't mean it's slow, right? I mean, Elon Musk is the sort of neck snapping kind of performance in his Roadster. The other thing too, I mean, the Challenger. Where they in their ads they talk about how they violate the NHRA rules. Well, in the next ad they can just say, and it comes with a $5,000 gas guzzler penalty.
Sure.
So salute Uncle Sam by buying this car.
And the few hundred people who buy that are going to be proud of
to have it. They'll have a sticker on the.
For some of us enthusiasts, we like them to be able to stop and turn. And so a little 4-cylinder sports car, a Miata or a Toyota 86 is plenty. The thing I worry about more actually are the trucks. I mean, when you talk about dinosaurs roaming the earth, GM and Ford and Fiat Chrysler make so much money on their pickup trucks, their big trucks, and I just think back to the Great Recession when 2 of those companies filed bankruptcy and the third had to borrow a lot of money and get some government cash for high fuel mileage cars. That the thought back then was that moving forward, the American companies should not have to depend on pickup trucks and big SUVs to make a profit. And they are still there, and that's what I'm worried about.
No, they absolutely are still there. There's no question about that.
I think what will kill the performance move is not fuel economy or emission standards. It will be insurance costs. And young people are already getting clobbered with insurance, and they're not going to be able to afford these performance vehicles because of the insurance costs.
You're right, John, and that's what happened 40-some years ago. The first muscle car period in the late 60s ended in the early 70s because of insurance costs, not because of OPEC.
Yeah, it wasn't that. Hey, look, we could go on and on here, but we ought to wrap it up. So, Joe White from Reuters, Greg Migliore, Autoblog, Todd Lassa from Automotive, thanks for sharing all your thoughts.